What is the Open Society, and what are its prospects in an age of rising populism? To discuss these questions, I'm pleased to welcome Lenny Benardo to a special edition of the Compact podcast. Lenny is a senior vice president for the Open Society Foundations. Among other responsibilities, he leads the Open Society University Network, which promotes research and teaching. He also leads the Ideas Workshop, which seeks to promote and inspire heterodox thinking. And he edits the Ideas Letter, an online publication that is both stylish and rigorous, and sometimes induces envy from other editors. I can speak from experience. Lenny is also a friend and supporter of Compact, for which we're very grateful. So, Lenny, welcome to the Compact podcast.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
So, can you tell me just a bit about when the Open Society Foundations began and what the impetus behind it was?
The foundations itself, Matthew, began in the 80s. George Soros set up the first of his national foundations in Hungary in 1984. His philanthropy preceded that. He actually supported Black South African scholarships in the late 70s. That may have been his first formal philanthropic venture. But the foundation network, as we know it, began in Hungary before the fall, obviously, of the Berlin Wall 5 years later, with an objective to helping promote what George Soros, a student of Karl Popper's, thought of as open societies that had broad public access to information and ideas, respected human rights, had norms around equity, democracy, and the like. And so began with Hungary, and then things, especially after 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, only took off.
You mentioned Karl Popper and Soros's reading of him. My understanding is that Popper is the one who really introduced the concept of the open society to public discourse. What's your understanding of Popper's kind of current influence on what the Open Society Foundations generally, and also kind of how do you draw from him for your work?
I should say first, the concept of the open society really comes from Henri Bergson, the phenomenologist, also Nobel Prize winner in literature in the first decades of the 20th century. But it was Karl Popper, certainly, and his Open Society and Its Enemies that was published during the war from his New Zealand readout, having left Vienna. That was most influential for George Soros, who studied with Karl Popper after the war, 49-50 at the London School of Economics. I think what was central for George Soros was Popper's philosophy of science. Less so his political philosophy or political theory, but his notion of falsification. And that a theory, for it to stand the test of time, had to be open to being falsified. Very large, open-ended ideologies, as we have known them, often are unfalsifiable and therefore don't meet that test of being a theory under Popper's verification principle. And I think it was that ethic, if you will, that drew George Soros to Popper, and the idea that ideas themselves need to constantly be contested, interrogated. And science, either natural or human, moves forward through that kind of ongoing interrogation. And I think that the first work of the Open Society Foundations in the 80s, it's no surprised that it was in things like scholarships and critical thinking and education as a means to ensure that interrogation of ideas and that openness to interrogation that obviously was rather limited in the age of state socialism and the former Soviet Union or Central Europe, that would be able to thrive. And so that was really the Popper connection.
Yeah, Popper criticizes Marx, criticizes Hegel on who Marx draws, and you can summarize this better than me, but I think it's fair to say he sees them as presenting these kind of totalizing systems where maybe the kind of the vaunting philosophical ambition maybe naturally corresponds to and perhaps helps to authorize oppressive forms of politics. Is that something like that, right?
Very much so. I think that was certainly Popper's reading of Plato or Hegel or Marx or Freud. But I think for George Soros, other aspects of Popper's broader theoretical carapace that he drew on were things such as human fallibility and the fact that we can never attain ultimate truth. No one has a monopoly on truth. Now, regrettably, the attacks in, say, recent decades on so-called postmodernists questioning or skepticism towards truth have in some ways diminished that powerful concept of the mid-20th century that Popper himself helped advance, that we need to always be careful of anyone who claims any form of absolute knowledge. The knowledge always has to be partial. And I think George Soros's work in the financial markets very much exemplified that same sort of set of political commitments, in that he never believed that markets clear, that there was full information in the marketplace. And I think he did very well as an investor in his own, for a time and then less so later, quiet critique of the kind of principles of microeconomics and the economics profession as a whole. But I think with respect to Popper, it was central to George Soros that people make mistakes and that those mistakes can be corrected and learned from. But they weren't mistakes that would ultimately destroy a broader theoretical project, but they're ones that constantly can be, in Popper's words, re-engineered. Popper talked about piecemeal engineering. And I think that sort of reformist impulse was one that George Soros held quite tightly. George was not a fan of revolutions. He saw the consequences of revolutions gone amok, in which a monopoly of truth and the notion of infallibility often are central. And so that notion of piecemeal social engineering, I think, stuck with him, both in his philanthropy and his financial work.
Yeah, you mentioned Popper's criticism of Plato, and that's maybe the most kind of impressive part of his ambition, is that he doesn't just critique more recent thinkers who are regularly dragged in his kind of pinatas for polemicists, what Marx say, but he really goes to the root of the Western philosophical tradition and says there may have been it was a wrong turn out of the driveway, basically a wrong turn at the beginning, and that seems like certainly a kind of a radical stance. And I wonder, to what extent, in your view, was Popper's kind of sense of these philosophical issues informed by the particular historical situation at the time? He's writing during World War II. I mean, Europe is being torn up by murderous ideologies. To what extent is he kind of writing in response to history?
100%, of course, no question. He was looking at National Socialism, having fled Vienna as a Jew, and he was looking at the onset of full-blown Stalinism. One could say Stalin where Stalinism had been already quite manifest in the 1930s. But as a post-war structure, that was also something obviously quite central for him. So yes, those totalizing ideologies, whether it's communism or National Socialism, fascism, I think were always deeply suspect for him because it assumed in the first and last instance that there was a monopoly on truth and that dissenters were not there to provide productive critique, but they were there either to get with the program, he who is not with us is against us, or to be shunted aside.
So I think the idea of the open society enjoys a kind of broad buy-in in the post-war era, and you can maybe see different ways that both sides of the political aisle are buying into it. To kind of be too rough and schematic, maybe the left is generally more comfortable with cultural openness, whereas the right's very happy to stress maybe economic openness, though also it may be hard to remember now, the right was once very open when it came to borders and migration as well. I think, the Wall Street Journal's official editorial stance was, and probably still is, a proposal for a constitutional amendment. There shall be open borders, right? So that idea of openness had such broad purchase. And it seems to me that, really kind of just about 10 years ago, things started to change in certain ways. And it was complex, but the most obvious change was this emergence of a populist right. Trump came on the scene then saying, I'm a nationalist, say that word, nationalist. And that really wasn't a word that people on the right used. That was not, it felt a little unnatural at the time. And then I think, it's a different phenomenon, but you also had, Bernie Sanders enjoying great success as a socialist and, or democratic socialist. I mean, I think he fits within, an broad American political stream. He wasn't absolutely radical, but there was something felt to be radical in the name, and that wasn't entirely off-putting. That was sort of attractive, actually, for a lot of people. So am I right on the timeline? Did something begin to shift then, where people were maybe beginning to pick up terms that had once been viewed with more suspicion when the idea of an open society had maybe broader purchase?
Well, look, after the 2008 global financial crisis, we recall, of course, what became known as Occupy Wall Street and the sort of simulacrum of Occupy Wall Street and the rest of the world, indignados, et cetera. And I think that the recognition that so-called neoliberalism more or less had begun to run its course from 73. And so I don't think Bernie Sanders, let alone Zoran Mamdani, would have stood the test of time were it not for what Occupy helped initially inspire, which was a very powerful and cogent critique of neoliberal economic and political economic policies. And so in that cauldron or crucible, the notion of socialism or social democracy or democratic socialism became quite useful for people because it articulated in fairly understandable ways what was being faced down in the world in terms of deep and profound and enduring inequalities. It was a language to make sense of that. And socialism is, I think, for many people, very useful language. And I think that Sanders himself was a rather sui generis figure. I don't know if anyone would have been able to be as successful as him, even with 9/11 offering those tailwinds. I think he was a very distinct kind of politician. But yes, the notion of liberal democracy, as we had experienced it the prior 20 years, say from the collapse of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Soviet Union in 91, to the economic crisis of 08 and 09, there was a period that we now use somewhat promiscuously as the end of history moment, the Frank Fukuyama gambit. But there was a lot of truth still in that. I think we did feel, and I say we, the so-called liberal international democratic community, that democracy, liberal democracy, was here to stay. And that the EU, as a good friend of mine wrote in 2004 in a book, the EU was going to run the 21st century. Europe was going to run the 21st century. And it seemed that democracy in all quarters of the globe was galloping apace in a way that it hadn't before, and that liberal forms of capitalism would go hand in hand with the dissemination globally of the democratic project. And I think we all became complacent because it seemed, of course, there were blips along the way. We'll never forget the Yugoslav wars. We'll never forget sort of genocide in Darfur. It's not as if the world was a purely rosy scene politically or economically. Clearly not. But it did seem that things were leading to a more promised, even if not radiant, future. And I think the financial crisis was the beginning of the end of that 20-year euphoria, where we came back to earth. There's that great scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen says, I think I'm going to come back to planet Earth now, when he was meeting his crazy Minnesotan brother-in-law. And I think that what also happened was a push. You mentioned some people on the so-called populist right, but a very firm push back against global governance. I think global governance was often unfairly maligned as being synonymous with global government. Of course, it wasn't about government, but it was about international institutions, international organizations, multilateral organizations, international regimes, the EU, the African Union, the Council of Europe, the International Criminal Court, the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and Malaria, that these would be the kinds of collaborative bodies that would, over time, further erode the power of the state. Of course, we'd still have nation states, but that things were moving towards solving global concerns through these new cooperative forms. So whether it's about climate or pandemic or nuclear weapons or inequality or migration or criminal justice, that they would begin to be solved by international organizations. And I think that there was resistance to that grew over the 2000s as well. Russia and China played, I think, a fairly powerful role in helping to kind of slice and dice a lot of international organizations when they saw that it was useful to sort of insinuate themselves within, say, the UN and different UN bodies, UN agencies. So that was unhelpful. But I think that the return to the nation state, as we're seeing it today, was also unforeseen in those kind of halcyon post-89, post-91 moments. We thought that the state was effectively, in Marxist language, going to wither. And it didn't. And we see now ethno-nationalism as strong, as intense as at any other point, I believe, in human history, or at least till the rise of the nation state. Wasn't expected. The recrudescence of nationalism in its current incarnation wasn't expected. So that sort of admixture of neoliberalism's failings and the sort of its broader attenuation, and at the same time, the recognition that international organizations were not the future for so many, all combined helped trouble the Open Society Project, has made it, has thrown up questions that I don't think we had been prepared to adequately or appropriately respond to, and that we're figuring it out as we speak.
Now, how central is the emergence of China as a power to this story? Because certainly when I think of the kind of the system of free trade that was established in this end of history moment, the all the strongest arguments for rebalancing toward kind of protectionism, I think, tend to be connected to national security concerns around China. There are other arguments, but those are the ones that generally have the broadest purchase. So is this story, this kind of move away from the open society, would that have played out without China's rise, or is that kind of essential to the story?
I think it's a central part of the story. I might dispute a little bit about its purely national security alignment. I think that the Biden administration's commitments to a particular kind of industrial policy is not just about national security issues, not just about China. Biden administration is very anti-China in what I found to be deeply unhelpful ways and problematic ways. But I think that their commitment to industrial policy was much broader. I think it was believed by many within the Biden administration that the exhaustion of neoliberal principles and practices perforce demanded rethinking the role of the state and the role that the state should and must be playing in the context of economic policymaking. But of course, it was also looking at China. China is sort of industrial policy on steroids, if you will. And I think appreciating the unbelievably transformative project that China has been for now since Deng, in the early 80s, the road that it's been on, much more authoritarian now than, say, under Deng Xiaoping. Of course, that was also seen in its own, perhaps, opaque way as a model for the industrial policy that some on the left had hoped to advance. China had to be in part a model. But I think the Chinese condition over these last years and the power, not just of the economy, but frankly, its commitments to questions on climate, its work in water and wind and green energy, have also played a role in forcing a rethink about forms of economic policymaking. I don't want to at all gainsay or dismiss the massive human rights issues that, of course, continue to plague China, whether in Xinjiang or Tibet, or what we've seen in Hong Kong in these last years. And it's a very, very autocratic state under Xi. But I think, frankly, what we didn't grasp in the Biden administration, because of its hawkishness on China and its sort of one-dimensional view on China, is how simply confronting a place like China, 1.4 billion people, of extraordinary importance, from critical minerals to artificial intelligence, to national security concerns, to simply confront and not focus on competition or coordination or collaboration, was terribly misguided. I don't think the Trump administration, frankly, has fully grappled with that, because the policy has been a bit, to put it nicely, haphazard. But I don't think it's as one-dimensional as the Biden administration was vis-a-vis China, quite honestly. But to bring it back to the open society point that you began with, Matthew, I think China's profound rise, and I think China's orientation to itself and the world, has cast new questions, skeptical questions, on the open society project that need to be themselves confronted and hopefully reimagined. I'm not afraid of the word ideology, as some people are. I think democracy is an ideology. I think Zionism is an ideology, and certainly open society is an ideology. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. There's no normative, marker to ideology. It's a way in which we understand our reality in a kind of shortcut fashion. And because of that, and because open society is an ideology, and because the world continues to change, and that the open society worldview of 30 years ago, or when George Soros was studying with Karl Popper, is very different from open society as an ideology today. And that also needs to be reshaped and reimagined to be consistent with the changes that have unfolded.
In addition to China's rise, obviously a huge issue here is migration. And right now in America, we're seeing public support swing away from Trump's policies. So there's not a kind of new stable equilibrium. But one thing I've been quite interested to see in the last year or so is a kind of move of some on the center left toward a more restrictive stance on migration. Obviously, the Labour Party in Britain, Shabana Mahmood just announced a kind of step toward restriction, increasing the wait times that migrants face when applying for permanent residency. Maybe kind of most notably, though this may be a separate case, is the decision by Donald Tusk, a Polish leader, generally highly admired by Atlanticist liberals, to suspend the right of migrants to apply for asylum. That's kind of taking place specifically in the context of conflict with Russia and certain concerns there. But when I look at all of that, I wonder if maybe we're entering a moment that's a little different.
Oh, I think that's fair. Look, when then Chancellor Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das," we'll get through this, we'll take care of this, we can handle 1 million migrants. That profound ambition and commitment is unimaginable today. You gave the example of the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. 3 months in to Tusk's government, he wanted to ban all asylees from coming into Poland, which of course contravenes international law. But
right, so that's that's a lot more radical than these other things we're talking about. That's a big step. That's a very big step.
And what's interesting, Matthew, is that he did it 3 months after defeating the party that had been in power, PiS, Jarosław Kaczynski, as its kind of titular head. And so there was no need to do that. There was no pressure on. He had just won the election, right? So the so-called liberals were back in power. And yet he took this step. Donald Tusk, a Europeanist at his core, right? He was in Brussels for however long. How did that happen? Why did that happen? I think what we need to face up to is the damage that was done during years of populism. We see this also in the UK. Keir Starmer, say what you will about him as Labour Prime Minister. I don't have high regard for him. Few do, I think. But he was saddled with years of conservative policies that have transformed the landscape, and populist conservative policies under people, obviously, like Boris Johnson, that have changed the parameters of what one can legitimately do. In the United States, the way in which the state is being transformed right now is going to make, should any Democratic Party candidate triumph in November of 28 and come to power in January of 29, she or he will be faced with a very different state. And people often forget that the state and the government are not the same thing. Governments come and go. Policies change. Taxes go up, taxes go down. but the state is a different entity. And so once USAID is eviscerated, the next person to come into power of another party is not going to just put it back. It's gone. It's dead. It's buried. It's not to say that you can't have a sort of rethink foreign aid, but it's not as if you can just put that toothpaste back in the tube. And so what we see with someone like Donald Tusk, when one is questioning, as I was 3 months in, you're going to ban the law on asylum? How can that be? Why would you do that? I think what it speaks to is the fact that the previous period of in this case quite reactionary populism was so deep and enduring and made so many transformations in not the government but the state, that and the broader kind of worldview of people as they understand, in this case, questions around refugees and asylum and migration, that to simply revert, as it were, to a more liberal or humane policy on migrants is no longer possible. It's no longer possible. And so a lot has changed since the flood of refugees in 15 and 16 transformed the European landscape. The level of demonization, of course, and the very rancid rhetoric around refugees had its own impacts, unquestionably. But we're living in a different time now, and we have to think of policies that are appropriate, credible, and legitimate to an electorate in this time.
Yeah, I think for myself, it looks like the center-left leaders are responding to democratic pressures. There are multiple potential responses, but basically they're following public opinion, in hopes of boxing out a populist right that would probably go further. So I tend to see it as a basically healthy phenomenon in broad democratic terms. But you see it as reflecting not just kind of those electoral pressures, but also kind of transformation in the state itself. Is there a kind of loss of confidence in the state to integrate people, or what's the exact issue there?
I think it's obviously quite multifaceted, but especially on the right, but on some portions of the left as well, the question of legitimacy in state institutions has begun over these last, say, 10, 15 years to just crumble. You look at, in the United States, the approval ratings of the U.S. Congress, I think, is in single digits. It's very, very low. People do not have faith in state institutions. People don't see those institutions as working in their favor. And I think the political rhetoric around that has only reinforced things. The notion of the deep state, paranoid as that often has been, has had its own efficacy, ultimately. And I think the reason why Doge was able to achieve, in my opinion, a criminal fashion, the clearing out of so many federal employees without any sort of assessment of actually what was needed. No one's going to question bloat, but you want to handle bloat in an appropriate manner so you're not obviously simply killing the baby in the bathwater. So I think that we've gone in excess, especially certainly in the U.S. in that regard. But it's very confusing now, because it's not as if MAGA in the U.S. context is talking just about a minimalist state. It's not some sort of libertarian project, certainly not. The state continues to play a very powerful role, just not necessarily in the way that we saw the state in the past. The state is itself being reimagined. And, I do believe, Matthew, that we are in not just the United States, but globally in an interregnum moment. And the form of liberal democracy that hopefully will continue to exist into the future will not be your mother's or my mother's liberal democracy. It's going to be changed. It's going to be altered. It's going to be reimagined. And I hope that's a good thing. People who say that they haven't changed their views in 50 years, I'm the same human rights activist that I was in 1960. I don't think it's a good thing. I think that you constantly need to live with history and politics and culture. And the idea of originalism has never appealed to me because life moves on. Culture changes. Conventions and mores shift. Systems of meaning are uprooted. We don't live in 1787. But the same is true for the kind of post-war welfare state that we knew, or the neoliberal order from 73 that we have been accustomed to, or the liberal democratic capitalist project that's been with us for these last many decades. Everything seems to be in flux right now. Some people call that a revolutionary moment. It may well be a revolutionary moment. But I think that all bets are off as to where these things are going to eventually settle.
Compact was started 3 years ago. We didn't begin with a kind of contract with America, kind of 100-point plan of where things need to go. I think we instead began with a sense very much like the one you just described, that there was a certain exhaustion and that we needed something new. Now, a term that Compact has used throughout its history is the common good, and that idea has a very it has a valence distinct from the idea of an open society because it kind of suggests, something shared or kind of a gathering together. And I think one thing Compact has tried to do is ask, well, what would it mean to seek a common good, to have certain shared loves and loyalties in a society that's very heterogeneous? Compact is a New York publication. We have contributors of all ideological and persuasions and sexual orientations and all that. So what does it mean to pursue the common good together? And we haven't yet figured out that answer precisely. But my own sense is that's the burden of this moment, and that it's somewhat different from that Popperian project. So this might be a place where we disagree, Lenny. I want to just read a kind of brief quote from a book titled Return of the Strong Gods. And I think it's one of the most helpful kind of critiques from the right of the Popper project. It's by R.R. Reno, my former employer at First Things. And he says, "Our shared loves raise us to a higher vantage point. We see our private interests as part of a larger whole." What do you make of this kind of talk of the common good that we're hearing more of? And do you think that there's maybe a version of that discourse that can be helpful or necessary, or are you more broadly skeptical?
There was a movement that kind of called themselves communitarians in the 70s and 80s, 90s. Michael Sandel, the Harvard political philosopher, was a prominent figure in it, that tried to marry the rights world with a kind of broader McIntyre-like community ethic. Many people, especially kind of hard-headed liberals, thought it utterly woolly. And if you can't reduce things to an individual, you're going to forever lose the plot when you start talking about, broader collectives. I found that suspect myself. And I always felt, with people who are staunch human rights activists, who see the individual as primary, who are committed to fundamental freedoms for the individual, they resist talking about responsibility. The word responsibility connotes something potentially paternalistic or taking away one's negative liberties in an unhelpful manner. And so strong rights people won't talk about responsibility. But I think that we need to follow that original impulse of the communitarians that was a bit of a dead end in its research program ultimately, but revisit what was positive in it, because I don't think we can live in a world that is only about individual rights. I'm a very, very strong supporter of rights as we have known them. I was at an event last night for my mentor, a guy named R.E.A. Nair, who was president of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1977, defended the rights of the neo-Nazis who wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, a place, of course, that had a disproportionate number of Holocaust survivors. REA lost, I think it was 18% of the ACLU's membership at that point, and took a lot of hits for it. But his book that came out of it, Defending My Enemy, was a kind of exemplar of freedom of speech and the sacrosanct quality of freedom of speech in the U.S. Something, by the way, for probably a century, people paid no mind to, was, in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, but wasn't something really until kind of, Wendell Holmes that people started to focus on, either jurisprudentially or within the broader culture. But that commitment to a fundamental freedom, like the freedom of expression, that, I believe, must be front and center, but not at the expense of or to the exclusion of questions around the public good and the kind of society we want to live in and the responsibilities that we have as members of that society, or at least that community. How you marry those two, how you stand in defense of fundamental freedoms and individual rights, and at the same time want to animate a form of communitarianism to go along with that, that's a vexing problem. And it can't only be left to political philosophers, or lapsed Rawlsians or whomever. I think that that's something that we need to figure out as a society. And I do think, Matthew, that seemingly the demise of neoliberalism as the kind of standard bearer form of how we think about markets and their power in the world, I think that its demise will be a contributing part of reimagining the community. Because I think the kind of marketization of everything, marketization of the state, the marketization of society, the marketization of communities. My kids, when they went to school, all their schools were being tested in the New York City public schools. Get more money if your tests are better. Everything was being marketized or tested in a kind of Bloomberg-like fashion in these sort of late days of neoliberalism. I think that had a really corrosive effect on how we think about community. So bringing those kind of metaphysical worlds together is the project of our time, quite frankly. And liberalism, has very, very clear, for some, boundaries between the public and the private. Raymond Geuss, who's a very interesting political philosopher and also a great critic of liberalism, in fact, has a very fine memoir called, I think, Why I'm Not a Liberal. But Geuss has looked over his career at those boundaries between public and private and how we define them. And I think that debate needs to be ongoing. If liberals feel that those boundaries are safe and secure and we know what they are, I would say that's a problem at the outset. I think those boundaries constantly need to be debated and deliberated upon for different historical and cultural moments. And I hope that that can happen. Your kids are younger than mine, but for my kids, all speech is political. And it's very different from what I was raised on. For my kids, as much as they would enshrine notions of academic freedom and freedom of expression, they would also balk that things are outside the bounds of politics and that need to be kept sacred somehow in order to ensure that our kind of democratic ideals are sustained. For a younger generation Gen Z today, all speech is political. That may be a step forward. I don't know. It definitely is not how I was raised, and I'm conflicted about it. But a lot of people today don't have a problem with sidelining somebody because their speech was not appropriate to a particular moment. That idea of sidelining somebody, marginalizing somebody, because their speech is not aligned with a particular political conjuncture, a zeitgeist, whatever, is something that I find intolerable, but that I also need to respect. Speech itself is an ideology. Freedom of expression is not an institution that sits, untouched on a shelf. It's part of the hurly-burly of politics. And so how we engage with, say, the Gen Z approach to the politics of speech is a very important thing to be just mindful of.
Your own publication, the Ideas Letter, if listeners go to the About page, they'll find the alarming statement there. We are not in the business of persuading. We won't try to convince you of anything. I think that's maybe somehow related to what we're talking about here. I'm grateful for publications and for writers that are willing to kind of show me something that I don't know and to let me make my mind up about it, rather than telling me you need to think this. And so there's something very kind of humane about that, something that maybe accords with a certain idea of the kind of dignity of the individual and his capacity to reason. And I think it's when you begin to look at notions like that you start to see the value of something like free speech. So the Ideas Letter, how do you plan to ever get much readership if you're not banging people over the head telling them so and so is bad, such and such is good?
Well, look, I feel, although I am told that probably 90% of people read the Ideas Letter on their smartphone, and I need to be mindful that we publish long-form essays, 2,500, 3,000, sometimes more words. And there's a commitment to it. And it's not all just hyperlinked. It forces one to engage with subjects that are going to challenge. But my entire work in the Ideas Letter is a piece of that, is not to ask whether one is going to zig or zag. I'm agnostic. I'm interested in what the Germans call Verstehen, kind of deep understanding. That's what I care about. I feel that understanding and meaning have been short-shrifted in this kind of age of inattention. And I don't think my kids are necessarily going to pick up, as I did at their age, the New York Review of each other's books, to read and to cherish. But at the same time, I'm not ready to say that long-form critical journalism that forces one to confront ideas of many different kinds and valences and registers, that's over. and I'm not ready to just TikTokify my work, to kind of meet the current moment. I want to find a way to promote ideas that are not based in a one-dimensional worldview, but that force you to recognize that life is complex and that people are complex and that people change their minds and that ambivalence is actually a positive thing. It's hard to say three cheers for ambivalence when you're 19. You want to say three cheers for this policy, that practice, the other politician. But what I've tried to do with the ideas letter is to show that ambivalence is a very, very productive thing for our community. Recognizing that you don't have the right answer and that you're open to other approaches, other modalities, other ways of cutting the cake, that those are positive things. That's how one learns, And I do feel that, and I think George Soros shares this with me, it's really through ideas, and it seems very antediluvian to say this, but it's through the kind of critical interrogation of ideas that change happens. And if we limit ourselves at whatever level, whether it's ideological, political, or institutional, or cultural, to one set of ideas, we're missing things, and we need to force ourselves to constantly understand and reason with, especially those who disagree with us, but also those who simply think about things differently from us.
I won't speak for you, but it seems to me that your support of Compact, your partnering with us through Open Society, is a vindication of your very real commitment to this.
And Compact, you have done, Matthew, in your 1,000 days or so in getting this off the ground, an extraordinary job. Because I would say are 8 out of 10 writers in Compact, except the ones that now I've read repeatedly, new to me. So you're constantly introducing me and my community to new people. But you are committed to rigorous intellectual inquiry and not tut-tutting or finger-wagging or banging the drum or saying this is what is right and true. And getting back to our original point about the Open Society, what you're doing with Compact is emblematic.
Oh boy, I maybe should resist that, or I'll lose my promoting the common good card. But Lenny, I want to thank you for joining us and for telling us a bit about the Open Society and its fate in this time.